Hello, Rockville Art League members. Thank you so much for Zooming in tonight. Um, we're going to have a wonderful presentation from the talented Karen Norman, but we'll get back to that in just a second. Before we go there, I have a couple of quick announcements. First of all, the Glenview Mansion Art Gallery has a beautiful watercolor show on display right now. The group is called the Tacoma Watercolor Group. The show is up for about another week, exactly another week. So if you have a chance to see it, you won't be disappointed. And please go over it. It is a beautiful place. Of course, with any show at the mansion, please be sure to go on to the Glenview Mansion website first to make sure there isn't a private event going on that might get in the way. So that's the first announcement. The second announcement is we're accepting entries into our spring juried show. There have already been a number of entries, thank goodness. And I expect that this show will be as beautiful as they've always been. And I'm so looking forward to it. Our judge for the spring show is Therese Capel, and she's done some judging for us before on some of our theme shows, and she is just so thoughtful and so talented. She's an artist herself, and I know she'll do a wonderful job with the show. Now I'd like to introduce Karen Norman. Karen is a member of the Rockville Art League. Many of you recognize her, and probably you are already friends with her. She tends to win prizes, and there's no surprise there because her work is absolutely beautiful. One of my favorite pieces of hers was a portrait of Zelensky that I think actually sold during the portrait show. But she's just a wonderful artist. We were talking earlier. She said that art and painting is in her blood and in her DNA. And since her mother was a highly collected local artist here on the East Coast, it literally is in her DNA. Karen is a Maryland person. She graduated with her MFA from the University of Maryland in College Park. After grad school, she went on to explore watercolor and became captivated. I'm reading from her bio here. Some of you have seen it. Not only is she captivated, but she's mastered the medium of watercolor. She's award-winning. She teaches, and in fact, I believe some of her class members have joined us today, and welcome. And we're so glad that you could join us. The one thing that in her background that I saw that was very interesting is that she had illustrated two textbooks that her husband wrote, and he's a psychology professor, or was psychology professor, perhaps still is, at the University of Maryland. Maybe she can share how that worked out. I bet it was fun. Hopefully there wasn't too much, deadlines and that kind of hassle going on. I know that I've left a lot out of your introduction. I just know that you're a wonderful artist and a wonderful friend, and thank you for making time for us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pat. What a wonderful introduction. I am so excited to be able to present what I have today. I have worked and worked on this presentation, and then I'm going to be doing some exercises that I believe will help any of you who are even dabbling in watercolor. I think it's the most wonderful medium. Many of the artists that I will show um, in just a few minutes worked in watercolor, and they worked in other things too. But watercolor is portable, it's perfect for plein air work. It's amazing in my humble estimation. Okay, so we're going to get started on my presentation for tonight, and it's called Watercolor a tour de force. And that's exactly what I feel watercolor is. It is phenomenal for many reasons, a couple of which I touched on, but many of the characteristics and humble beginnings and everything I'll be talking about this evening during the presentation. Okay. Now it's important that you all see this presentation because
It's up now, Karen. We can
Alright.
see the slideshow.
Okay. So I am going to be explaining a little bit about each one of the slides as we go. This is one of the amazing cave paintings that have survived in Lascaux, France, estimated to be upwards of 10,000 years old. The paintings consist primarily of large animals that were once native to that region of France. And if you want to look into more of them, they're there. Now you might say, but watercolor, these aren't watercolor. Well, they were ground pigment that were attached to the wall with some kind of binder. Now, while they don't know everything about these paintings, they certainly are amazing that they have survived the centuries and that they're so playful and beautiful. Amazing, right? This one is an Egyptian papyrus painting. Now, I realize we jumped a few millennia there to 500 BC. And one thing I did not do was go into Chinese painting, which is probably between 2 and 4,000 years old. But that's another whole genre that I'm not really going to get into tonight because that would be all night, right? Okay, so we're going to go from here to an illuminated manuscript from roughly 1100. Many of you have probably seen gorgeous illuminated manuscripts in museums. Um, I remember I was introduced in college to illuminated manuscripts. And then in grad school, I had to purchase this little book. The Hours of Jean Devreux. You will see all the little amazing figures and various things that are going on in this beautiful watercolor. Now, what's really amazing about this is that it was all created in the grisaille technique. And if you don't know anything about grisaille, it is basically painting with gray. So everything was painted in gray, grays and brown shades.
Zero fact going on here, which the Democrats seem to think can be solved by etiquette and following normal.
And the color was then added later. Now, in color painting at that time, an artist or the people who worked with the artist had to grind pigments and then put some kind of a binder with it. Oftentimes that would be honey. Albrecht Dürer painted this in roughly 1500, and he was alive in the late 1400s until about 1528. And this painting, called The Great Piece of Turf, is phenomenal. I was so fortunate to see the real thing at the National Gallery a number of years ago when the Albrecht Dürer show was viewing there. So we're kind of jumping centuries, but then we go forward to an amazing woman, Giovanna Garzoni. She lived from 1600 to 1670 and started out with portraits and um, other scenes from that area, religious scenes. And then she found these watercolor still lifes were definitely her thing. And she was in such high demand that she could name her price on any of her paintings and get it at that time in Florentine, Italy. So we're jumping another, well, this is actually during the lifespan. He was born in Great Britain um, and a year before, 1599, 1641. Anthony Van Dyke. Um, these are just beautiful little studies, and I loved this one, and I thought I would, you know, put this one in for your viewing tonight. This is, you probably all recognize, this is a Rembrandt van Rijn. He was alive from 1606 to 1669. We don't have watercolors from him, but we have these beautiful pen and ink and wash studies. So this is all a wash that was used very similarly to any watercolor that we use today, but all with brown ink, possibly walnut ink, which I've recently been exploring a bit myself. And then we move forward to Paul Sandby. Now, Paul Sandby is interesting because he used paints from map making in his watercolors, which I thought, wow, how innovative was that? Um, so he would uh, collect ideas, pencil sketches, etc., and then go back and paint these in his studio, in his work area where he was making maps. Um, this is Michael Rooker, somebody who was alive at the same time, and they may even have known one another, um, and another British watercolorist, and he was quite renowned. Um, his middle name is actually Angelo, so he was Michelangelo Rooker. I think he got a lot of teasing. This is William Blake, 1757 to 1827. He was a real innovator in watercolor. And you can see from this painting of Stonehenge that he manipulated the paint in some new ways, which was amazing, for people to see. Um, there are a lot of his paintings in the Tate in London. This is John Constable. We have many of his watercolors that have been left for us. This one was roughly the turn of the century. He was alive from 1776 until 1837. And this man was born just a year before, Thomas Girton, and this is his most famous painting called The White House, and you can see why. The atmospheric qualities that he got in this painting are truly remarkable, and so he was very well known, but unfortunately died of tuberculosis as a very young man. He was best friends with J.M.W. Turner. And this is one of Turner's watercolors that were a good deal later in painting. Turner loved watercolor, and we have a tremendous number of his watercolors. If you want to look up some of his watercolors from Venice, they're, again, just gorgeous. we jump to John Cotman, 1782 to 1842. And this man, it's kind of too bad because Cotman paints are named after him. And I don't quite know why, because those are the student grade, and he was anything but a student. This is just one example of his very bold watercolors. He wasn't afraid to use darks. And this is just phenomenal, this painting. But you can look him up too. John Cotman painted many British landscape scenes. So this is a good point in the presentation to put in what happened in the rise of watercolor as we know it today. So watercolors at first were distributed in pans that when the pan watercolors began, they were so hard that you could barely make the um, the cake of watercolor come to life. And that was because they were practically pure pigment. And a great discovery was made that if you put glycerin in your paints, in your pigment, with your pigments, that then the pigments suddenly come to life. And so this is a beautiful old box of something from the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's no date on it, with these early pan paints. So here's the artist's color tube. Now, whether you are an oil painter, now an acrylic painter, or a watercolorist, you probably are using pan, or you're using tube paints. But believe it or not, when paints were first manufactured, they were put in bladders, pig bladders, that had to be perforated, as you can see, and closed with tack. Um, and then this was the first patent tube that was actually in glass. And then these are the early metal tubes from 1841. So some great things were happening out there with the Industrial Revolution. And the first collapsible metal tube was made by this American John Rand, who invented a tin tube. And then, you know, boy, Winsor Newton was off and running. So the the metal tubes, as well as the pan watercolors, were off and running. Here's a moist color box ad from 1890, complete with a little water bottle and space for brushes. And these also are from the Winsor Newton archives of early paint sets. This one and this one in particular are worth talking about because they were the size that you could put in your pocket and pull out for little watercolors. Pretty incredible, right? So all of this was also brought to life by the fact that then we had the longest reigning monarch until the until Queen Elizabeth, who just passed away, and that's Queen Victoria. And she really loved watercolor. And if Queen Victoria loved watercolor, then all of England loved watercolor. So people went out and bought these sets, which became very affordable by the later 1800s. So John James Audubon, 1785 to 1851, would, at the end of his life, have known and probably used some form of portable watercolor. This is Elizabeth Murray, 1815 to 1882, and a study of a tree. And certainly she was using these Winsor Newton watercolors in a pan um, of some kind, whether she had the tubes or moist pans. James McNeill Whistler is the next artist, 1834 to 1903. And another innovator in that he liked to paint these foggy scenes and also nocturnes. So this is a beautiful little painting of his. This is Paul Cézanne, 1839 to 1906. And it's really worth noting that he used overlapping washes in a little bit different way than we looked at with William Blake. And you can see that here, the overlapping washes that made this an amazing painting. Then I go to the wonderful Winslow Homer. He made a statement. He was alive from 1836 to 1910 that he would live by his watercolors, and he made good on that. An American artist. He did spend time in England, but he painted extensively in the Adirondacks, and this painting, his most famous, The Blue Boat, was one of his Adirondack paint scenes. We then go to Thomas Moran, and this should give you an awesome overview of artists and their time period. Thomas Moran, 1837 to 1926. I was just reading today a little bit more about how his painting, which is actually down at the American Museum of Art, which is what, roughly 8 and G streets downtown. His view of Yellowstone made people move west just by seeing his painting. So this one was painted during the U.S. Geological Survey across the country. This is at Pont Neuf in Idaho. Wow, what a scene. And again, how did this take place? Portable watercolors in tubes. And I thought this was wonderful to also have this self-portrait of Mary Cassatt, who was born in 1844, lived to 1926. This has a bit of gouache in it as well, but mostly watercolor. Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. I know one of his watercolors was recently discovered. And wow, that's that's always a fun thing to have a Vincent van Gogh found in an attic or whatever, and I think it was in the Netherlands. But in any case, we all know Vincent van Gogh, but he had a number of watercolors, and I love the way he used his watercolors with very beautiful values, you know, the darks and lights in the scene. Just a gorgeous watercolor there. And he was roughly a contemporary of John Singer Sargent. Here's Sargent, one of his beautiful Venice scenes. There are, well, I went down to the Sargent show that was up, what, a year or two ago down at the National Gallery. It was phenomenal. And this is a gorgeous watercolor from his time in Venice. And by the way, he painted extensively plein air. And you have to remember that prior to, okay, he was born in 1856, that prior to tube paints, pan paints, these moist pan paints that didn't even come on the market until 1835, that artists then really depended on these moist paints to take out in the field. This is another wonderful woman, Mildred Ann Butler, 1858 to 1941. This painting is hanging in the um, the Art Museum in Dublin, their National Gallery, and it's a huge watercolor and just took my breath away when I saw it a number of years ago. This is Child Hassam, 1859 to 1935. Again, an amazing little watercolor by, well, one of his paintings hangs in the White House, and you're probably very familiar with some of his um, New York City scenes. A brilliant American artist. This is Percy Gray, 1869 to 1952. He was the painter of California, and this is one of his beautiful scenes looking down to the water of the coastline in California. And this even has a date of 1925. Then we move to 1866 to 1944, Vasily Kandinsky. Now, Kandinsky's work was very playful, very fun, very imaginative. Um, and I have one of his beautiful watercolors here, followed by a Paul Klee, 1879 to 1940. And you can see this one looks like it was 24 or something thereabouts. Can't exactly tell, but a beautiful Paul Klee. Henri Matisse, 1869 to 1954. You're probably all familiar with his paintings and also his cut paper work. I remember seeing a show just of his cut paper collages. This is Charles Demuth, and he was with us from 1883 to 1935. He favored um, these types of still life paintings when he was painting in watercolor, but he's also done a number of other works that if you fall in love with Demuth, you can look up and see other things that he painted. John Marin, 1870 to 1953. This man was a huge phenomenon in the 30s, 40s, early 50s, and has now fallen out of favor somewhat, but just another very imaginative painter. Edward Hopper, you'll all recognize that name, 1882 to 1967, one of his dramatic, bold watercolors from the New England area. And Georgia O'Keeffe, one of her powerful, colorful watercolors, 1887 to 1986, that Georgia O'Keeffe lived. And this is another wonderful, very imaginative artist, Charles Birchfield, 1893 to 1967. A lot of people loved his imaginative work, and this is a piece of his here. Then we go for a little a ride back to England. This is Jack Marriott, 1901 to 1968, and one of his typical scenes following World War II. He made many posters so that people would begin traveling again and enjoying the countryside. This is Roland Hilder. A lot of people are looking back at him. He wrote a couple of wonderful books during his lifetime of 1905 to 1993. And I've got a couple of them. And this artist got me painting skies. He said paint a sky a day, and I took that pretty literally and started painting a sky a day. I have stacks of skies. Anyway, moving to Edward Seago, 1910 to 1974. This man was highly collected, also collected by the Queen, and he's so popular today, by anyone who is interested in plein air painting, because that's what he did. This was painted on location at the water in England. And we moved from there to our beloved Andrew Wyeth, 1917 to 2009. I was very fortunate to see a watercolor show of his, that was at the Brandywine Museum. That's just a couple of hours away. Um, and it was so fantastic to see watercolors from this artist when he was 20 years old, and his first watercolor show at 20 sold out in New York. This is Trevor Chamberlain, um, a much beloved British watercolor artist, 1934 to 2021. And when I think of Venice, I don't know why I think of this painting. For me, this is, uh, it's breathtaking. I love the way he put it all together. It was painted on location. He was another person who loved painting plein air and has, again, inspired another whole generation of watercolor artists. And actually, we're going to end there with artists who are now deceased, but Trevor Chamberlain just passed away in 2021. And I think he was almost 90 something. Anyway, yeah, 90 something. Anyway, here's another beloved artist. This is Joseph Zbukvic. He's in his early 70s now, an Australian watercolor artist who is pretty much world renowned. Hugely followed. And this is, again, a painting of Venice. I used to tease and say if I was doing a presentation, there would have to be, if it was a landscape artist, a painting from Venice. And it's nearly true. Artists, just landscape artists, like to go and paint Venice. Okay, so now we're going to go to our, well, inimitable Mary White. Many of you have seen her work. It was at the, her show, We the People, was at the Army Museum, and it was also at the Marine Corps Museum. And this is one of her paintings. This is not from the We the People presentation, but this is my personal favorite painting of Mary White's. And basically because she is the most incredible portrait painter, but I loved also the textures and everything. But look at this woman, the wrinkles, the translucency of her skin, and all painted with watercolor. Truly phenomenal. And this painting is another like all-time favorite watercolor paintings by one of my favorite watercolor painters, Dean Mitchell. This is obviously from 2010. And the look on that man's face, the way that he holds the drum, everything about him is, it's like it's this perfect painting. You feel the emotion and the sensation that Dean Mitchell put into that painting. This man, Joel Papadix, he loves fog, and he is the present president of the American Watercolor Society. And I just thought this would be a perfect painting to show. I love his work and I love this painting. This is Tian Chung Wei. Um, Another very famous artist now on the scene, and another terrific painting. This one from 2019. Probably all of you will recognize Thomas Schaller, another watercolor artist that I first discovered actually at Strathmore Hall at a show. And I actually got to meet him when Thomas was very young. I think that show was maybe 25 years ago or more. And he was showing with several other artists at that time. This is Patricia Guzman from Mexico, and she is the foremost watercolorist in Mexico at this time. And I'm going to end with Herman Pekel, another Australian artist, because I want to end with this quote by Herman Pekel. Watercolor is funny, a bit like living life forward and understanding it backwards. Let watercolor take you where it wants to take you. I love that. So we're going to wrap that up now. And I'm going to show you a few of my own paintings that I am working on or finished, as well as do a little demo. So here we go. Take my water over there. All right, so I hope that we will be able to get this all together. There we go. Complete with a, I think we should do a little pan of the studio just to let everybody see this great studio space. We really built the studio on a shoestring. And Kent, the tech guy, did most of the building. We laid the floor together. I did a lot of the brickwork outside on the lower part under the siding. And I remember talking to my dad at the time, and he said, Karen, there's really nothing to it. You just mix up the mortar and lay the bricks. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And so we put the studio together.
Skylights.
And yes, skylights. Yeah.
Down 2 weeks.
Over there.
We wouldn't even be anywhere near this price. Okay.
I think we've got something on there. Okay, so I was talking about well, I'm going to talk about the importance of everyday painting. And this is something that I believe in so much. It's so important for everybody to paint as often as they can, because when you just leave it and you don't exercise your painting muscles, you get a little rusty, just like any other important thing that you want to do. If you were a piano player, you couldn't sit down and play the piano after practicing a week ago. So I'm a firm believer in painting on pretty much an everyday basis. So I'm going to show you a few little pieces right now. Many of these were created in 5 or 10 minutes. I like to do these kinds of little studies where I'll, do things in different colors, different, kind of move things around and experiment with things. And some of these little pieces will turn into larger pieces. Here's a little study that's in progress right now that I just need to to add the foreground. This was a night scene that I did from memory. And literally this one was 5 minutes. A little scene here of Vista. And vistas are very fun to do because not only are you doing cool to warm, but you're also, playing with light to dark so that you have all of these fun things that are going on in your painting. And these kinds of little studies are, what I'm talking about. This is 5.5 by 7.5. But also these wonderful, let's see, this is another, I'm not sure if this is from this one, but I found these on Amazon. These are wonderful 7 by 10 sheets. They're all cotton and you can get, like 200 sheets for something like $29 or $30. So they're very helpful to have little sheets like that around. But you can see my various sizes of experiments and fun things that I just, play with. And I'm just showing these quickly. And I have some more here to show you that are larger and some of them more finished. This one is, these are all going to be 11 by 15. Something I love doing, this is,
Karen, if I could interrupt quickly, could you possibly hold the microphone a little closer to you?
Oh, okay. All right, or speak up. Frederick Douglass, and I've got a couple of them here, one as a young man and one as an older man. And these are my, I love painting the old boats. This one and this one are now sunk. They were over in Tillman Island. I have painted this scene quite a number of times and I changed the colors and the feel of them every time I paint them. And I just love, that particular scene. I did a lot of sketching. This is from a different angle. And this is one of the boats that is no longer because it was rusty. And it was an old boat, an old work boat, and they decided that there was no point in keeping it. This winter, I was experimenting with a number of snow scenes. After having spent some time out in the snow. Let me go to one more of those before I go back to a couple more. Thought I had one more of the snow scenes. No, maybe not. And this is one that I had actually almost finished before. And I went and finished it because there were some things that I just needed to get right. And of course, you recognize this as Abraham Lincoln. Sojourner Truth. This is one of elephants that I know a couple of people who are here today are familiar with. And one of a raccoon with some salt. And this is actually on a hot press sheet that I don't usually use. Most of my paintings are on cold press or rough. And that's puts us up to where we're going to go right now. Okay, so I'm working on a sheet of 11 by 15 paper, which is a quarter sheet of a watercolor, a full sheet watercolor piece of paper. Okay, so they're 22 by 30, unless you buy elephant sheets or, or larger. Some people like to buy their paper in rolls. and you just cut it to any size that you want. But I have been buying mine in, just by the 22 by 30 sheets. And so all the paintings that are up on the wall and, a number that have been in Rockville Art League shows are full sheets. So that means they're 22 by 30 and then framed to be about 30 by 38. And I feel like that's plenty big. So I haven't gone beyond that. Okay, so how am I working tonight? This is actually, and I work on different paper depending on my mood and exactly what I'm going to do. This is a sheet of Saunders Waterford. And before I get started on this, I'm going to take a misting bottle and I'm going to wet both sides. This hasn't curled too much because it's 200-pound paper. I'm gonna wet the back, but it's on these special sponges, and you're probably wondering, what are these blue? Got a couple of little blue sponges here put together. And they're special aqua sponges. They're actually pretty expensive, but then once you buy them, they last. And I get them wet, wring them out and lay them down. The paper, since it's wet, both front and back, in this case, since I'm gonna be doing something that I hope to finish, or nearly finish tonight, which is kind of a big joke, right? To some of my students who know that I'm not that fast. But anyway, I want this to be evenly wet. So I'm actually going to take paper towel
Oops.
and go over that.
I'm getting there.
Okay. So I have now a wet sheet of watercolor paper, but it's not really wet, it's damp. And I don't have any puddles. If you looked at this from an angle, it's going to be looking almost dry. But I know it's damp and ready to go. Oh, another little one that I was gonna show tonight too. Okay. Here we go, and I'm gonna start with one of this is a hake brush. And I'm going to use this to lay down a sky as soon as I see the painting up again.
Working on.
I have actually, this is a really, I've had it for years and years. This is a pan watercolor. But if you, as soon as you get it wet, it is pretty amazing. It's a special little Winsor Newton pan. I think, because I kind of lost it for a while and found it again. I think I've had this for 30 years. I mean, no kidding. So anyway, I'm gonna start with this. It's cobalt blue. And I have an image that's in front of me that I am going to be doing a number of changes to or with. I'm gonna flip this over. And just make sure that this is all evenly wet. It's often good to spray it again when you're using this particular method, which again, I'm hoping to do pretty quickly and have to dry it times as well. But we'll see how things go. Okay, so I don't know if anybody else can see this. Oh, good, they can. All right. You can see what I'm working from. And I'm just going to check my paper. So I don't really want any little places where it's too wet. And then I'm gonna move other paintings out of the way so they don't get speckled and spotted and all that kind of stuff. Most watercolor papers, you can use either side, and it doesn't matter which side you use. But Saunders Waterford actually says that, that they have one side that's actually better than the other for painting on. So I'm gonna paint on that side. And I'm also going to talk my way through part of this. Okay, so when you're painting in watercolor, if you pre-wet your paper, you generally are going to use more pigment because the paper's wet, right? And when anything is wet, it's going to disperse more. That's part of water and it's characteristic. So I am going to start now with a little bit of my sky. And I want to get this beautiful cobalt shade in. I also want to skip areas that I'm then going to kind of do some clouds and other stuff. So here's my blue. And I can also lift out anything that I want, which is another great way to work. Now, this photo that I'm using has a couple of great things going for it. One, you can really see the change in the sky from very blue to having a bit of almost like there's green in the sky. And then going right down to where it's going to switch over, I need this. Everything responds a little bit differently. Your paper towel is going to work a little differently than tissue. And I want to make this kind of soft and atmospheric. So I don't really want too much of a white area here, even though I left it. So I'm gonna pick things up as I go in order to create kind of a bit of cloud that will come across here. And into that, you'll need a different brush now. I am going to add some other colors. Put a little bit more of this kind of greeny blue. And I'm also going to put, I'm gonna add a little bit of a quin red to this. That's then going to mix in. See, I have that area right here where there was a bead, so I could keep on working. When I have gone over the entire painting, I'm actually going to switch so that you can see what else I'm going to explain tonight. I'm going to add this right on down to about that 1/3. You have 2/3 sky and 1/3 water, land and water in this case. And I'm also going to add some small areas. Clouds. Just got a little mix of colors here. I try to keep with a pretty limited palette for any one painting that I do, because everything then is much more coherent. And there we go, just adding these little bits. And an important thing to add here is that the paper is still very wet. So I don't have to worry right now about disturbing whatever else, because it's all wet. So the only thing that I could do right now that would be totally wrong would be to go into this with too much like added water, but I'm not. I'm keeping to a more similar mix. And I'm also going to add some thin cloud shapes down here at the horizon line. So I put down and then slowly kind of lift, allow other things to happen here, because I want to get some of those long, thin cloud shapes that happen as you get towards the horizon. So it's quite different than the clouds above. And this just happened. This is what I would call a happy accident, just the way the water and light, and I don't know, it just worked. And those are always beautiful things to have happen while you're painting. And you have to, use those to your best advantage and hope for them to happen oftentimes. And also, don't be afraid to use your fingers. And the last thing is know when to quit. And that's probably the hardest thing in watercolor, is knowing when to quit so you don't overwork things. Now at this stage, it's all fine. It's wet. You can move the paint. You can do all these, little things. And I love using my fingers. It's part of what, I guess goes back to childhood and finger painting and all that. Okay, so now down at this point, I'm going to be using much richer paint. So I oftentimes use what's already on my palette. Over here, I had a mix of some darker colors that's going to go in a minute, but I'm also going to put in this kind of mountain, distant mountain or hills that are back there. So I'm making a gray, in this case with ultramarine blue and raw sienna. So at this point, I have about 5 colors that I've used so far. I have cobalt blue, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, raw sienna, and I used a little bit of the Quinn color. So I'm going to put in my hills back here with this neutral gray. Okay. So I'm gonna put that neutral gray in. And that's going to be great. Add a little bit over here. And here's another thing that I have to say right now. When you work from a photograph, the very worst thing that you can do is be a slave to the photo. You want to use the photo to give you tips and ideas and I don't know. I think there's nothing like being inspired by a certain place or a visual memory so that you can carry that. This is, I'm varying my color a little bit now. And I'm also going to be coming down and getting a little bit more of this wonderful color, this raw sienna and ultramarine blue makes a beautiful, you can see that, kind of a dusty green. And so that green can go in here. And I can even, skip little places that can, I can decide later if I want to change something or I do want that kind of golden color. So I'm adding one more color to my mix, and that's twin gold that I'm mixing with my raw sienna, and I'm going to add that in here. And then I'm going to go for my water. There's really not that much water in this scene, but it's very important. It's an important part of the little scene that I'm painting. So I am going to add that in. I'm going to come back to do some of the darks. And see. Okay. That's about it. That's about all the water that we get. Maybe a little more right there because I'm also very mindful of the fact that I'm the artist and I get to change whatever I want. This is where you get to make lots of great decisions. And I love that. There's a lot of things that we don't get to decide in life, and in your paintings, you do get to decide. And there's one little part that I missed here, and that's that the water then extends over here. So I want to keep that water going. Here we go. It should do it. And I want to be able to stop for a few minutes while things are going to have a chance to dry a bit to tell you about a very important thing that every one of you can do. Now, this is an area that's actually a bit too wet. So I'm just going to lift this just a touch, and you can see this is wet lifting, and I can just pick it right up with my brush. And then I am going to leave this for a moment to show you a practice that I have gotten involved in and that I think everybody should do. This is one of them, one of the little experiments. You can choose 3 colors. That's what I like to do. And choose a brush that's fun to use. One that I really like is this. It's called a lizard lick. And it's a Cheap Joe's brush. And it's got a big belly and a very tiny little point. So I can take 3 colors. In this case, I'm going to use phthalo blue. I'm going to use Quinn, let's see, that's Quinn Rose, and I'm going to use Quinn Gold. So I can start. And this is obviously the phthalo blue. And I can just, I mean, this is very inexpensive paper. This is actually from, what's the name of that store? Five Below or whatever. And you can get pads of paper like this for under $5. I realize it's not cotton, but it's perfect for just getting to know pigment, brush, values, what will happen if you do this, if you do that, whatever. So let's go just to the Quinn Gold. And then you're gonna get a green. And that's quite obvious. Yellow and blue. But what would happen if I took that and began to mix it with the red, the Quinn Rose in this case? You're going to get mixes that are going to give you all different realms of neutrals, as well as your, colors right out of the tube, so that you can be familiar with how wet your brush can be in order to get a certain something that you want to have happen in your paintings. And you can use these little warm-up times to inform yourself of certain things that are going to happen. Like this. If I go into a dry area of my painting and go over it with little lines and whatever, then it's going to do that. Wet on dry. But if I go into a wet area, particularly this area where you can see that there's a little bead, then you can do quite different things. Another thing that I like to do is to load up pigment on a liner brush. Make sure that I like to dry off the point where the ferrule, this is the ferrule, meets the bristles, and different things will happen. Obviously, that's a very thin line, but if I use this thick paint, even where it's wet, it's going to behave. And it's going to give you pinpoint color areas, all kinds of cool things that you can do with this. Experimenting with calligraphic lines, whatever you want. This is your page to experiment on, to warm up with before you get started on anything else. Now, I had already done this a little while ago before we started, but this is something I love doing. And sometimes you can experiment with little, let's go with an area that's This can be a whatever. Can make it up, landscape kinds of things. I'm throwing the yellow in. Experiment with your brush stroke. Experiment with everything. Try taking something, I've got just the permanent rose, and squish your brush and twist it and see what happens when you do that. Sometimes you can create flowers this way or whatever that you need in your painting. So it's a phenomenal thing to do in order to get better at your brush strokes and just have fun. There's not enough play. There's not enough in our adult world. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about real briefly, I don't want to forget the importance of PEP, play, experimentation, and practice. Without practice, you don't learn, you don't grow. So it's an important part. And here's another thing. When we were kids, we never worried about materials. Our parents gave us stuff and if you ran out of paper, you asked for more. And we tend to worry too much about our supplies and, oh, I can't use up that, and get rid of that mentality. So when you're doing this, you're not copying anything. You're not working from anything but your own self, your own patterns, your own colors, and your own brushstroke skills. That's what's really important. So the subject familiarity, the technical skills, planning and presentation, that's all going to come out of doing things like this, where you just explore with your brush and do it all the time. Do this, if everybody else is watching a movie, well, pull out your sketch pad and do some practice, you know? Okay. That's important. Okay, back to my painting here. Now, parts of this have begun to dry a bit, and I'm getting some interesting little things. And this is a place where sometimes it's even good to throw out your resource, your photo, and just rely on visual memory. You know, I do this a lot myself, because when we're out in the car and I'm not driving, I can sketch, and obviously everything is going right by. You're driving 50 miles an hour on the highway or whatever.
70.
But that's okay. While you're driving, you're also observing. And those observations are so, so important. And it's a great place to hone your skills while you're just in a car and you would otherwise just be sitting there or scrolling on your phone. Don't do that. Make time to sketch. I have a little watercolor set that I leave in the car. I also have a pencil and a sketchbook that's just for pencil drawing. So between all those things, it's perfect. I have plenty of things to keep me occupied. Now, here's a funny one. My granddaughter, who's 6, the oldest one, she now keeps a whole set of supplies in their car, because she wants to paint and do whatever every time she gets in the car. So, all right, we should be like that. We should be like kids, right? As long as you're not driving and somebody else has got the wheel. Okay, so now here we go. I'm going to get a little bit more of my ultramarine blue, and Lisa and Pat, you'll have to tell me where we are time-wise, because now that I'm painting, I don't know.
Well,
yeah.
it's 8:15.
Okay,
So we can certainly go on for another 15, 20 minutes.
okay, then that's great. That's perfect for me. I'm going to try hard to finish this painting, because I chose it because it was fairly simple and straightforward. And so I should be able to finish a lot of this. And, you know, where I have areas, let's go back to my ultramarine. And it would be nice to also add a bit of burnt sienna. So now I'm up to what, 7 colors? If you have burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, which are great colors to start with, if you just want to start with a couple, that's what I would start with, just to find out what's going to happen. Now, this is an area that's still damp, kind of dangerous area, right? When paper is damp, but I just want to hit this with a few darks right along here. And then I'm going to kind of, this is something that's farther away. I'm gonna make this one a little taller. I want to vary everything. And that's what I think about a lot. Whenever I go back into my paint, that I want to get, and see, that's a little bit darker. I want to get a little different color. And let's dry this. Do a little bit of lifting. That's giving that lovely, this is the burnt sienna that's giving that lovely color right there. And where you have burnt sienna in one spot, you have to think about where else you're going to put it. You have to have things that mirror one another. I like to think about triangles in a painting. I think that's an important aspect. Now I'm going to do some scumbling, and we'll just see what happens from here. And I'm going to just take the side of the brush. This is the same 2 colors. I want to be a little bit heavier on the burnt sienna. And just put this down and see what's going to happen here. And then from this point, grab this brush, my raw sienna. This is again my hockey brush, hockey. I know, how many words do we slaughter as Americans? Oh my. Anyway, have this be a bit warmer as it comes forward here. This is again my raw sienna. And part of the smoothness in the paint application is due to the back of the paper being wet. So I'm putting a little bit of the Quin Gold here too as we come forward. I think that's going to be nice. And the reason that I stopped and talked about brush strokes is that they're so important. Watercolor as a medium is all about timing. It's the only medium that is all about timing. While, yes, there are certain things you have to remember in painting with oils. And I'm well versed in that, having done that in college, and I've also managed to repair a few of my mom's paintings from just my knowledge of oil painting. But there's something so magical about watercolor that I would urge anyone, no matter what their first choice of mediums would be, to also take up watercolor, because they tend to go hand in hand, and you can do so much with this. Okay, so I'm thinking this might be a place where I can pick up lights against that dark. Sometimes I will pick up something and think about it. I don't have to be tied to it, but it could be a good idea. I could need a little bit of light there. And sometimes when I do it, I go, what was I thinking? And I know that I can change that. And you can see what's happening here. This is, it comes to life. It's all just, it's all damp. I generally, when I'm painting by myself in the studio, I will let things dry and I will come back, once I get the initial washes in, and then I can keep working without worrying. Okay, so I've got that going. Now there's an interesting thing that happens in here. I'm going to switch brushes. Actually, I'm going to try to find my other brush. I've got all kinds of goodies here to use, but a few really favorite brushes. This is a small porcelain palette that I started using because I like the way the washes mix up in this. It just seems to work really well. And we're gonna, one other thing that I wanted to have happen in here, that was a little bit of that, and I'm gonna see how that works. And I'm also going to take my little liner brush, and this is where I can start going into little bits of things. This is what I was just doing in my sketchbook, where I was just working with my brushes, calligraphic marks, whatever. I'm making a little reflection now. I want this to be a little bit lighter than what's over, what the real thing is. And that's the reflection underneath. And then I also want to get, oh, it's always so much fun. You're in the midst of a painting, and isn't it all, it's so exciting. I mean, this is the exciting stuff. This is where I want some of my dark here in the back. These little brushes, the little liner brushes, they're sort of magical, in that you can do so many, fun things, and you can make a line and then come back and just work that, get the reflection in the water. And I'm also putting some movement, a little bit of movement in the water. Probably should have some geese or something like that. And there's such interesting darks all through here. And I'm going to add right in here some of those darks. I don't know what they are, like little kind of bush things or whatever. And a little bit more. And this is, again, where you can pull out your you can pull out your liner brush of great challenges, talking and painting sometimes at the same moment. It can be really interesting. Because you're focused on two things at once. You're using your the right side of your brain, and then you're talking, which is the other side. So it's a little challenging. At this point, though, if anybody has a question, it might be a good time to ask questions. So they're not all at the very end.
Aaron, can I ask you a question a little bit about the historical paintings that you showed earlier?
Absolutely.
Well, I do know that often oil painters might go out and use the watercolors for studies and then later on complete an oil painting from those watercolor studies.
Yeah.
But to me, the ones you shared earlier look like completely finished paintings.
Yes, they did.
So I guess they fully intended that to be not just a study for future development in oil, but to be the complete composition and finished painting all in one.
Absolutely. And that's, we have Turner, we have Winslow Homer, we have John Singer Sargent to thank for that. Truly. I mean, they were amazing innovators, and all of them worked in oil, and they also worked in watercolor. And towards the end of Winslow Homer's life, he wanted to paint in watercolor and forget the oils. So it's interesting, you know, just the different decisions that artists have made about what they are working with and why. And, you know, for many artists, because of the portability, it was just perfect, you know. So I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about now as I kind of finish what I'm doing here is that I don't want to overwork anything, and B, that I want to put the excitement where I want it to be. So So I'm trying to think about that at the same time. That's what I find challenging about doing a presentation or teaching anything and then explaining everything as you go along. But I try. I want a little bit of the, also the reflection here. I find these little liner brushes to be invaluable now. You can see. I mean, they do a lot. Okay, so let me make a few marks. I'm going to make some darks here. I'm gonna make a few, that's still too wet. Okay, I've got one post, and that was with a not too wet liner brush, but this is all wet. First of all, you know that I'm working on a tilted board, right? I'm gonna pick that up a little bit because I don't want to have it be just feathering everywhere. So go back to some of these other darks. And this is what I was just talking about. This is where your timing can get challenging. And so after I am finished laying my initial wet wash, I will often walk away if I don't want to ruin a painting. But you can see right here, I use the side of my brush. You get wonderful little lines that way. Things that you wouldn't have happen, you can make things skip. All kinds of great things just by experimenting with your liner brush. Okay, I'm gonna try to see what else is going on. This is kind of in funny lighting, my photo. So I can't exactly see everything. And then when that happens, I tend to let my imagination take over. I am going to do that here and stop looking at my reference photo at all and just finish in the next couple of minutes here with just my, I'm gonna put some of these. This is really wet, so I've got to be careful. Sometimes I will actually put paint down. I'll leave it gives you a ghost image, as you can see. I don't do this all the time, but I think here it needs it. I'm just going to add a little bit more towards the front as you come out towards the viewer. I think it needs it. Even one more application to get a little bit richer, deeper color here. And I'm gonna have to wait to put the foliage or the grasses in here. So this is a second wash in this case to kind of tie things together. That could be really helpful. You can even move paint by doing that, as you can see here. I sometimes picture Thomas Moran and going across country with the US Geological Survey, and I try to lean over his shoulder. You know, he's one of those giants that I admire. And it was because of him that we have Yellowstone National Park. For those of you who don't know that, yeah, he was a powerhouse. When he came back, he charged a quarter for his to view his paintings, and people paid it. And you're like, wow, okay, I'm gonna put a little something in here. This is where a lot of the fun stuff happens. And if you've never tried working on a sheet of paper where it's wet on the back and wet on the front, try it. It's great fun. It is the way Andy Evenson paints and a number of other artists who have kind of picked up from him. I need a light, like a bluey color back here. Just let me know when you want to stop and I will end. And I can eventually send out the painting. I can send it to
So
you.
at some point, I mean, we've kept you quite a long time, longer than we told you that we'd keep you, and thank you very much. I guess there's some steps that you'll take on this once it's a little more dry, or tomorrow even.
Oh,
to,
definitely.
Is that correct?
I'll study this and I will add grasses and other aspects of the landscape that I want to add. But right now, a lot of it is done. I just have to be patient. This is the timing part of watercolor, and I don't want at this point to pull out the hair dryer because we're at the end pretty much, right?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm gonna quit now. And what I'll do is finish this and send it to you, and you can send it out. How's that?
That'd be great.
All right, for the end of the, the end of the session or whatever.
I'm always so amazed when I see such a talented artist that can pull such a work together in such a short time. And it's just awesome, I think. And thank you so much for sharing. And we will get this recording out to our members. And I so appreciate you taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you, Pat. This has been a pleasure. I love to paint. If I didn't have other things I had to do, I wouldn't leave my studio.
Before I turn it off, did anybody else have any questions, before we sign off?
Buddy,
I have a question.
Okay, yes.
Karen, when you mentioned about having the color and I thought, God, what is it? The burnt sienna in one part of the painting and then in another part. Isn't that true for red as well? Can't hear you.
Yeah.
I can't hear.
Karen, we can't hear you. We see your mouth moving, but we can't hear you.
okay, we had to switch microphones.
Okay, now we can hear you.
All right. Oh, oops. I think I just did something wrong. There we go. Okay, so Winslow Homer, he was known to put red somewhere in every painting.
Mhm.
But there would be a little bit of that red that would be mixed with something else that he would put somewhere else in the painting as well. I remember listening to an artist talk about how they had made a complete faux pas with a painting in making a building with a red door, and it was the only red in the painting. You don't want to do that. You want to
Mhm.
distribute your colors. And in studying a lot of other artists, I've seen this wonderful triangle thing that goes on in a lot of work. So you have it here, here, and here, the three places. So very good idea.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more question if anybody wants to jump in. Okay, well, again, Karen, thank you so much. Tell Kent that we appreciate his help as well. And we look forward to seeing you soon, perhaps in our upcoming juried show. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. Have a
Bye.
good week. God bless you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.